So the death penalty in California is a big part of our judicial system. We sentence people to death regularly and don't actually kill them on a regular basis. So California sort of has the worst of both worlds when it comes to the death penalty. And we'll take a look at it. So California banned the death penalty in 1972 through a California Supreme Court case. The people of the state of California versus Robert Page Anderson outlawed the use of capital punishment in California, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was retroactive. So there were 105 people on death row at that point, including some pretty big names like Charles Manson and Sirhan Sirhan, who had attempted Robert Kennedy's assassination. So they were both on death row along with 103 other people, and so they were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. And so every few years, Charles Manson would come up for parole, and of course he never got it, and eventually died in prison 40 years later. So then the people of California with Prop 17 said, no, we want the death penalty, and so through a ballot measure restored the death penalty in California. Meanwhile, the United States Supreme Court on that same year, 1972, was a huge year for death penalty issues. And so in that same year, the Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment is unconstitutional, that the way it was being enacted was arbitrary and capricious, and so cruel and unusual, and therefore unconstitutional. And so even though California had just passed Prop 17, they couldn't have it. However, in Furman opinion, they suggested that they weren't opposed to the death penalty per se, just the way it was being used. And so if there were standardized guidelines for juries that decide sentences, if some of the methods for the death penalty were reformed, they would be in favor of supporting it. And so 4 years later, Gregg versus Georgia, with 66% of Americans still supporting capital punishment, even though it had been banned for 4 years, the Supreme Court acknowledged progress that had been made and reinstated the death penalty. So now California gets back. The rest of the country gets it back. Any state that had the death penalty could have it back. And so from 1976 until today, we've got 747 people on death row. 725 of them are men, 22 are women. But no one has been executed since 2006. And there's an article you can see in the module about lethal injection. One of the reasons that we haven't been able to execute anyone since 2006 is because we don't have an approved method for killing them. And that's been a problem throughout the states, not just in California. So 13 people in these years. So California was able to execute 1978. So in 40 years, 13 people have been executed with the death penalty in California. And you can sort of see that no one sentenced after 1984 has been executed. And so all of those folks, 747 of them on death row, are awaiting trial. Here's one of the biggest problems with the death penalty in California. Execution, actually killing someone with the death penalty, is the 5th leading cause of death in California's death row. Can you think of the others? What'd you come up with? So obviously, if nobody's been killed sentenced since 1984, old age is going to be one. That's the leading cause of death in California's death row is old age. They are simply elderly and die on death row. Second is disease. We have huge healthcare costs on death row. Third is suicide. More people have committed suicide than have been executed in those years, and more people have overdosed on drugs. So when execution isn't even in the top 3 of the leading causes of death, you're doing something wrong. And California is not doing the death penalty well. Whether you agree with the death penalty or you don't, we're spending the billions of dollars to keep them, in solitary confinement and to have the appeals and to have the process, and yet we're not actually executing people. Public opinion is turning away from the death penalty, and the number of executions have dropped. You can sort of see the 1990s were big on, tough on crime measures, 3 strikes you're out, term limits, that idea of punishing criminals. The 1990s were really big on this, and so, that was kind of the peak year for executions, and it has dropped precipitously after the turn of the century. A number of states have actually banned the death penalty. Exoneration rates have really changed people's opinions of it, as 27 people in the state of Florida have been exonerated. There was something wrong. There's a lot, and I'll post some videos on what's called prosecutorial misconduct, which is when the prosecutor in the case, the district attorney in the case, knowingly goes after somebody who did not commit the crime because, there's political pressure to have a conviction. They want to put somebody away. But prosecutors have immunity. They can't be sued for that. So even when they knowingly convict somebody and put them away on death row, there's no way to prosecute the prosecutors. So that's a big problem in our judicial system. California has had 4 exonerations where we realize through DNA evidence or a witness recants their testimony. There's a lot of exonerations where people have been found to not be guilty. And that changes people's mind because the death penalty is permanent. And so if you find out after you've sentenced somebody to prison, at least you can let them out of prison. But if they've already been executed, there's no return. For a long time, we believed that the death penalty would act as a deterrent. And it turns out that research, what we want to use is not our opinion, but research, that research shows that it doesn't. And the regions that have the highest use of the death penalty, where you would think it would be more of a deterrent, actually have higher crime rates and higher murder rates. Now, in the state of California, you can't exactly use that research very well because we sentence people to death, but we don't actually execute them. So does the death penalty serve as a deterrent? I don't know, because we don't have a lot of examples of the death penalty, even though we have all of these hundreds of people on death row. But in other states that are more efficient at execution, we're clearly seeing that the murder rates don't go down. You don't have this sudden repentance of criminals. It's also really discriminatory. When you look at the race of the defendants who are convicted and sentenced to the death penalty, even the cases in which the prosecutor chooses to pursue the death penalty tend to be people of color and people of poverty. And so we do see discrimination in that case. Juries are more likely to convict a person of color over a rich white person being sentenced to the death penalty. The exceptions tend to be the celebrity cases. Scott Peterson in the state of California, who killed his pregnant wife in this, really vicious murder. And most of the death penalty cases are really vicious. It's not just murder, but first-degree murder with special circumstances. It's in the commission of another crime. It's, with kidnapping or sexual assault. So they're heinous, heinous crimes. It's just whether or not this method of punishment actually is effective. Study in California found those convicted of killing whites were more than 3 times as likely to be sentenced to death as those convicted of killing blacks, and more than 4 times more likely as those convicted of killing Latinos. North Carolina found that your odds of receiving the death sentence rose by 3.5 times when the victims were white. And in 96% of the states where there have been reviews of race and the death penalty, there was a pattern of either race of victim or race of defendant discrimination. So we're clearly seeing patterns in the selection of which cases get the death penalty, and the conviction rates as well. And then there's the cost. When you look at the cost in the state of California with automatic appeals, with habeas corpus petitions, the cost of federal appeals, and the cost of incarceration, it's really expensive. So we spent $4 billion. Alternatives, the public opinion is starting to see that maybe alternatives would be better. When you simply ask whether people support the death penalty, you get a much higher number than when you ask if there's a method other than the death penalty. And really, life in prison without parole is much more popular with people. They also like restitution, the idea that prisoners in prison are working to pay off some sort of debt to the victims fund. When you look at those two combined, you have a majority who support a life sentence without parole. And we have that option in California. It's called LWOP. We use it a lot. And there's simply no parole option. So in 2016, the folks who wanted to end the death penalty put a proposition on the ballot, Proposition 62. It would have done exactly that, ended the death penalty in California. Those sentenced to death would be sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. And in California, if you get that sentence, you're paying restitution. So there would have been restitution involved. And the pro-death penalty folks were really worried. But they did something really strategic. Instead of campaigning against it, they could have spent millions of dollars talking about, how great and wonderful the death penalty is. Well, that would have been a little bit difficult, because if you had done that, people would have brought up, and Prop 62 people would have brought up, it's not effective, 13 people have been executed, it's the 5th leading cause of death, blah, 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 blah. All those things. However, Prop 66, the folks said, we don't want to defend the death penalty. We want to talk about how bad it is, and that we're going to fix it and make it better. So we don't think you should be opposed to the death penalty because of the way California does it. We think you should vote for our proposal because we acknowledge that the death penalty has problems. So here's the interesting thing about the initiative process. If you have 2 competing issues, you can't do both of these things, right? If both Prop 62 and 66 passed, you would be at an impasse. You can't both reform and repeal something. So when you have competing ballot initiatives in California, the one with the most votes wins. So even if both of them got 77% of the vote, whoever got the most votes would win. Brilliant strategy by the pro-death penalty folks, because you don't have to convince people that they should save the death penalty. You have to convince them that they don't want to get rid of it, that they want to fix it. And that's what they did. So Prop 66 says one of the problems, most lawyers don't want to take on the death penalty cases, and a lot of the delay in appeals are because half of the current death row inmates don't have an appeals lawyer. And so Prop 66 would create an expanded pool of attorneys by requiring any qualified lawyer to argue appellate cases. It would direct the courts to conclude both the direct state appeals and any habeas corpus appeals, and it would dismantle death row, and they could put inmates across the state. However, big problems with this. Number one, attorneys don't want to do that, and so maybe they just don't argue appellate cases. Number two, Colorado tried to conclude the appeals process fast. It's failed miserably. It's just a long and arduous process.